thank you for being a friend. Travel down the road and back again. Your heart is true, you're a pal and a confidant. If you threw a party and invited everyone you knew, you would see the biggest gift would be from me, and the card attached would say, thank you for being a friend.
Hey everybody, I'm so grateful you're joining Beloved Journal today. My name is Rob Lee and I am the host of this podcast. Today we welcome the Reverend Dr. Greg DeLoach to Beloved Journal. Dean DeLoach is currently serving as Dean of McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. He is a native of Eatonton, Georgia, and has pastored congregations throughout Georgia for nearly 3 decades, including places like Mansfield, Chickamauga, Marietta, and Augusta. Following 10 years as pastor of First Baptist Church Augusta, he became executive director of Developmental Disabilities Ministries, an Atlanta-based nonprofit that serves adults with developmental disabilities and their families through the operations of 19 homes across Georgia. In February of 2017, he joined the development staff at Mercer, having previously served on the university's board of trustees. He was named Interim Dean in 2018 and appointed Dean in 2021. Recently, I have been captivated, and that's to put it lightly, with his hilarious and relevant TikTok videos on the subject of death and dying for the course he's teaching in the spring at Mercer University. You can audit this hybrid course whether you're in Georgia or beyond, so be sure to check it out and reach out to him if you want to talk more about what today entails in our episode. But without anything else to say, let's listen in, and thank you again for tuning in to Beloved Journal. Dr. Greg DeLoach, thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
I am delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So I'm minding my own business, scrolling through Facebook one day last week, and all of a sudden I come across a video of you with a skull, presumed fake at this juncture. But then you start talking about things that I heard about. We've talked about death, but you're talking about them in a Christian context and teaching them at a seminary. Tell me what you're up to there at McAfee.
Yeah, well, first, let me just confirm that the skull, though realistic, is very much fake, purchased from Etsy, and but it is a replica of in this case, a male skull. Although I'm happy to report it's a non-binary skull. I've given the name Francis after Saint Francis, because while we often associate Saint Francis appropriately with birds and bees and so forth, with the feast of Saint Francis a couple of weeks ago, he's often depicted in the art world with a skull, because Francis was encouraging others to reflect on death and dying. Memento mori in the Latin, remember that you will die. So I'm teaching a course next semester, Death and Dying, that I'm excited about, which may sound a little strange, but as serving in the ministry as a pastor for about 30 years, that was the work I did all the time. You're either talking with people either about death and dying in their lives or with their family members, or in very direct ways working with church members. So anyway, that's just kind of a brief little teaser. And Rob, please no criticisms about my TikTok videos. I am a 57-year-old just trying to make it work.
No, I mean, it's awesome. It's really fascinating. It caught my attention. It caused me to pause, which in this fast-paced world where we're so consumed with getting on to the next thing, it's really interesting. You know, when we talk about death, I think about when I was growing up, a very young age. My great-grandfather died, and yet I was convinced that I needed to be a part of the ritual of what was going on. So much so that I actually wanted to help bury him, which was, we actually had to get permission in our town. That wasn't something that happened for people who I think I was 4 or 5 at the time, and we bought me a little shovel, and I was able to put the little first swig of dirt onto the casket, and then we went on our way while everybody else took care of business. What is it about death that causes us to pause, whether we're young or old, or
Yeah.
rich or poor, gay or straight? What about that causes us to take a second out of our day and say, "Oh my gosh, that's going to happen to me too"?
Yeah. Well, you've said several things that's of interest to me. First off, is how we've so separated ourselves from death and dying to the point that there's laws or ordinances or cultural norms in the last century that have detached us from death and dying. Hence, needing to get permission to help bury a loved one when for thousands of years this is what people have been doing. So we've professionalized and made it an actual its own economy, so that unless you are the expert, you can't really be a part of what should be the more natural process. Now, that's just one thing real quick. But to your question, more to the heart of it, what is it that fascinates us? And that's the deeper question, which I am look forward to having more detailed conversations with students as we reflect on that. I think it does come down in its most basic level as I think it was it wasn't Carl Jung. It was no, it was Ernest Becker who wrote the book The Denial of Death. He postulates that there are two driving fears in humankind that separate us from all others, and that is the fear of life, which I think is pretty compelling in its own right, and then it's corresponding the fear of death. And so I think whether it's both fear that compels us, but this notion that at an early age we begin to discover that will happen to me too. And for some, there's this morbid fascination, right? What does that look like, feel like, so forth? And depending on one's family environment, you hopefully will have healthy ways of processing that and communal ways of embracing that, or at least understanding how that's celebrated. So, yeah.
I love Eugene H. Peterson's comparison of the church as being a colony of life in a land of death. The church has a lot to say about what it means to die and to die well. The church should have a lot to say about what it means to die and to die well. I am echoed across the ages by many a clergy who have said, "Give me a funeral any day over a wedding." I will give me that. We can do that. Let's do that. And I don't mean we have to kill people or anything like that. I'm not one of those clergy, but we do have to. I like the idea that we can talk about death as a way that leads to life, even though it is very hard and very real and very palpable for all of us. What is the church's location in all of this, being this colony of life in a land of death?
Yeah, and everything you said, I think, is right on, from Eugene Peterson's remarks to the typical clergy person saying, "Gosh, I'd rather do," and I've said it, I'd rather do 10 funerals than one wedding. Now, some of that's just practical, right? A wedding has a stress level that's a little hard to put your finger on, that I think is more culturally induced, versus a funeral where you are really circled with people in need and you're allowed to be in need with them. For starters, that and this is actually beyond the Christian tradition, but I think about Daniel Callahan, a bioethicist, who writes that it is hard, if not impossible, to die well outside of community. And so there's this essentialness that, regardless of one's religious tradition and faith practice, you've got to, in order to die well, it requires people being together in that. And to the specifics of the Christian tradition, it's really is leaning more into what does life and death mean. And so dying well really circles back to living well. If you want to die well, that constitutes living well. It's not the same thing as a good death, which I think is a little bit more debatable. Anyway, and there's plenty of biblical texts, both in the Old and in the New Testament, that speak of this. I've got an article coming out on the Psalms the Psalms just simply assume death is. They don't try to resolve it like, well, there'll be life after or anything like that. It just simply is a reminder that that life is a breath, it's a vapor. Life is fleeting, and therefore number your days, like in Psalm 90, so that you can gain a wise heart. We go to the New Testament, kind of understand death too as ironically, a way to live life. Jesus says, if you want to gain your life, you must lose it. And so there's this relinquishment. The Eucharist is all built upon the language of death. Revelation brings us to that in order to speak of a beginning, there must be an ending, to kind of use a Jürgen Moltmann phrase.
It's so interesting. My mom works for hospice. She's a director of education for a hospice house here in Statesville, where we live in North Carolina. And one of the things that we are often struck with is the lack of preparedness for something that is so inevitable. I actually have it right here. I pulled it out before. I have a red folder here that has my final wishes about what every verse of For All the Saints I Want Sung at my funeral. And yet we are so reticent to do that.
Yeah.
It is this final battle between our own egos and our own ability to do the things, whatever the heck we want to do. And yet what has been determined as the course of humankind since humankind was humankind. How can Christians, and we can expand that to people of goodwill everywhere, live as those prepared to die?
Yeah, a very, very good observation. There's one writer in the mid-50s, and he uses the language, the pornography of death. And basically his argument is what sex was to Victorian England in the 19th century, or Victorian era in the 19th century, death is in the 20th century. It's not like we are not surrounded by death. I mean, my goodness, we cut on the television and there's news of death everywhere, violent and otherwise. We're entertained by it. We stream movies and we play games that are focused on death, but it's always death. It's fictionalized, or it is somewhere else. But when it comes to, so we make it almost a pornography, a voyeur activity, in order to really avoid speaking of it substantively. I think the response to that is in part cultivating healthy conversations. And they don't have to be as sterile or certainly not academic as saying, okay, today we're going to talk about death, but rather natural. It's as easy as, I think, sitting with a group of friends and just kind of sliding into conversations of saying, hey, my uncle passed away and this crazy thing happened at the funeral. What do y'all think about that? And then it could be anything from conversations about, well, how do you want to be preserved, so to speak, when you die? Do you want to be cremated? Do you want embalming? Do you want to be composted? Several states you can have your body composted, which I think is pretty awesome. That's a whole nother conversation. And so there's some movements that are not tied in with any religious tradition, called death over dinner. And it actually, you can look that up on the internet. There's actually guides to how you can have a dinner and just say, hey, today we're going to talk about death. And it's not going to be morbid necessarily or heavy duty, but we just want to have these conversations. In the church tradition, you got this. I mean, that's the easiest way to have conversations, is have a Sunday school class or a Bible study and just say, what do y'all think about death? And you can begin as academically as, well, what does the Bible say and all of that? But I really think it's more accessible than that. It's like, well, why is it important to have a funeral? And if it is important, is it a celebration of life or is it to grieve? Thomas Long kind of challenges our whole notion of saying it's a celebration of life. He says, well, it's also time to just say, well, doggone it, I'm mad or I'm upset or I'm going to really miss my dad. And I want to have some space to lament. That's a very legitimate response for a funeral or a memorial and so forth.
I'm a graduate of Duke Divinity School, and I hope you won't hold that against me. But
Not a bit. No, no, no. In
Stanley
fact,
Howard, yeah, Stanley
let me let
Hauerwas,
me let me interject. A great writer out of Duke was Alan Verhey,
yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
who died in 2014. But he's written several things related to death and dying, and perhaps one of his most well-known books was a treatment on death and dying. And it was a pretty comprehensive book. I'm going to require it for my class in the spring. But anyway, out of Duke, and ironically passed away a couple of years after publishing that book.
Yeah, yeah, and he prolific. Stanley Hauerwas. I remember in the class I took with him, which is kind of a rite of passage for a lot of Duke students, or it was until his retirement. There was a moment in the class where he marched us all out to the chapel, and he pointed up to it and he said, "This used to be the center of campus. We used to fear God. Now the center of campus is the medical center because we fear death."
I don't think I've heard that.
It really struck me, and he went into the whole, his whole spiel about the Book of Common Prayer and give us a slow death so that we may make recompense for those things which had been wronged. I mean, and I get all that. My mom, again, we've talked about her final wishes. She's got a long way, Lord willing, until that happens. But she jokes that sometimes she wants to be a paperweight because you can do that now.
Yeah.
I don't know how effective that is in the digital age, but all that's to say is this march that we have in our lives towards that inevitable moment. Or whatever movement, whatever you want to call it. I do like Tom Long's idea of it as movement from one place to another, both as practical as taking the body to the tomb or the place where it will be committed to wherever it's going, and the idea that we go from this place to wherever God intends for us. I mean, in our world, a fast-paced everything, it causes us to slow down whether we like it or not. And what I'm getting at is what Bill Coffin talked about when he said that it was the great equalizer too. Like, I mean, we're all headed there, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What is it about death that causes us to be so ill prepared in that moment, to stand before God, to say goodbye? I mean, is it because we don't want to say goodbye? Is it because we're headed somewhere? Or is it because don't want to leave? What is it about it that causes us to be so ill prepared when it finally comes?
Well, your opener with Stanley Hauerwas is appropriate because here again in the 20th century, the terminology post-World War II was a medicalized death. And so we're grateful that the health care is such is that we're able to do a lot more, and the lifespan is expanded actually quite dramatically in the last 100 years. I don't think any of us would be critical of that. But we've medicalized death to where it's assumed it will be institutionalized and removed it. Prior to the 20th century, the typical corpse would have been brought home, kept in the home, actually, perhaps even prepared in the home. And so death would not have been nearly as mysterious or separated from the average family, the average individual. Now we've driven it away, so to speak. And so it's become not only mysterious, it's become quite frightening. We really don't know what to do with that. And so illnesses and sicknesses have become institutionalized. The descent, if that's I don't know if that's the best word, but that's a convenient word, the descent into death becomes something that has almost a haunted feeling to it, and we'd rather run from that. These are kind of a very normal. I mean, I can't say that I'm not won't respond accordingly. I feel healthy and well today, but we're only one step away from this being our reality. Here again, I think in faith communities, we have this opportunity to speak more directly about this, to engage conversations that, no pun intended, that are life-giving, because we're speaking of these realities with us. One of my goals with these silly TikTok videos, and they really are silly in the sense that I'm saying something serious, and then I conclude with a dad joke, which is only intended to just sort of hey, we can have conversations about this. But one of my goals is just get some attention to this. And then if nothing else, if someone goes home and says, I just saw the stupidest video or TikTok, it was 60 seconds long, but it made me think, well, I don't know. So I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know if I answered that question, Rob, but you're welcome to kind of punch back a little bit if you need.
Well, no, I think so 2 years ago, my wife and I adopted two girls, and now they're 5 and 6. And if you want to wrestle with theology, talk to a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old girl, because they are wrestling with these questions, like the theologians like Hauerwas and Willimon and all the people that we look up to, and they are doing that work too. I think what has struck me about being a parent is the realization of one's own mortality and the things that we can't prevent and the things that we can't change. It is striking in our world to send a child to school knowing that one of the ways that the children have met death in our time has been through school shootings. Something that is entirely preventable, yet we can do nothing to prevent right now on our own commission and ability as an individual person. What I'm getting at is that there are deaths that are horrific and painful and not good. One of the things we were talking before we went on air about my friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Lee, who was a McAfee graduate where you serve as dean. He did his DMin there, and I remember a particularly fraught funeral we did of a suicide in the community, and that in and of itself was painful. So while we've made light of it, there is also this really profound and abiding pain.
Mm-hmm.
I hope you might speak about the hope that we have as people of faith, that this is painful, yes, but it is not the end. And that there is something that what Marcus Borg talked about when he said we buoy up to God, and that's all we need to know, even though we don't know all the specifics of it, as some Christian traditions try to spell out. I'm kind of the mindset I don't know everything about what's coming, and yet I know the one who holds that coming. So I hope you could speak to about that. We're in a culture that is fixated on death, and yet we worship a God of life.
Yeah, right. And that goes back to that language of pornography of death. So what we've done with death, because of our fear of it, we've created these obscene caricatures, again, through fiction, through even desensitized to it. So we're coming this week off of the violence of Israel and Gaza that's captured our headlines, and how quickly we forget that Sudan is also immersed in its own type of continued near genocidal civil wars that have been taking place for 2 decades. Ukraine, I mean, we could go on and on, right? And then I've raised 2 sons where school violence was becoming more the reality, but not like it is now. In other words, it was always elsewhere, but you've got kids that are having to go through drills or even very real shutdowns. And so the vulnerability of this is my child and I need them to survive. And yet I can't, there's nothing I can ultimately do to protect that life or my own life. So what does it, come down to? If my life is so utterly vulnerable, which of course it is. I mean, it is, it absolutely is. What is that? Then where do I find a sense of hope or assurance or peace? And that's the, that Jewish notion, Hebrew notion of shalom. Where do I find that shalom? I love, I mentioned Moltmann earlier, and there is that reminder that in the end, the beginning. And so that we're moving through these transitions, and they're both on a time scale, right? They're, in order to experience God's generative or flourishing beginnings, there must also come endings. There is, and Henry Nouwen writes beautifully and devoted, kind of in devotional style language, of that all that God has given will not be lost, including what happens in death. So, and then of course the biblical reminders, such as in Romans, that nothing can separate us from the love of God. And so these are things not so much meant to, we hang on to them as a life preserver, although at times in our lives we need them as a preserver. But they also, I hope, can provide us with a sense of how do we then live with the assurance so that we can live our lives fully and not fearfully, which also includes, being a parent and realizing that every day my child boards the school bus, I'm having to let go of some control, knowing that there may be, this could be the worst day ever of my life. And I don't mean that to sound quite as dark as it can be, but rather, how do you embrace the shalom, let alone the larger languages of resurrection, and being held in the keeping of God. Revelation 21 has long been my favorite passage for gravesides, because I think there's probably no better words when you're surrounded by the opening of where you're burying one's hopes and dreams and love, to be reminded that there'll be a day where there's no more tears, where there's no more pain, no more suffering, that the former things have been put away, and that all things will be made new. I need to be reminded of that, not just at the graveside, but on a near daily basis. So we simply pray towards God's newness. And some of that does remind us we can't run away from our responsibilities, that when life takes its most horrific turn.
I want to, when I have my friend Shane Claiborne, he does the tools where he beats the guns into garden tools, literally beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, kind of thing. And he also works really profoundly with the work on those people who are on death row, who we as a society have chosen no longer need to live, which is a whole nother conversation that we can't even, we obviously. One of the things that I notice about people like him, myself, and I wonder about you, is that in some way or another, we who deal with death on a regular basis have ourselves been touched in such a way by death, either by questions that we have, fears that we have, or personal experiences that we have, in such a way that there is nothing else that we could talk about first. At least that's been my experience. So I wonder, has death touched you in such a way that this is what you got to talk about right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I would like to reflect on that more, but I know time doesn't permit that. I think it was Pope John Paul, had spoken about we are, and he was referencing the 20th century about being surrounded in the culture of death. So I don't know. I mean, that's actually quite a personal question, but a good one. On the one hand, yes, we are surrounded. I do think, for me, as a clergy person, to kind of put some distance to it, there's no question that the liminality of this life, you're just reminded that it's brief. And then one of my favorite books in the Hebrew canon is Ecclesiastes, and some people find it a depressing book, and I don't at all. I think it helps to begin with a notion that depending on the translation, vanity of vanity, all is a breath, it's a vapor. But I think when you begin with a notion that things are precious, it leads you to a fuller embrace. Henry David Thoreau writes in his opening pages of Walden, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately and front the essentials of life, and to see what it had to teach, and not," he says, "when I come to die, discover that I've never lived." He ironically died rather young, comparatively speaking. But I like that kind of notion of to lean more meaningfully in. I mean, just think about it, Rob, of all the conversations we have that are so glib and superficial. One meditative practice is just approaching every parting conversation with someone, friend or foe, as if this may be the last words you have with them. So how would you really change those words, even if they're your enemy? But if you were to read in the paper the next day that they are here no more, you can't help but think, I wish I would have maybe said something differently, or at least taken in more how more precious it should be.
I'm preaching in Fort Lauderdale this weekend, and it's been one of those weeks of writing a sermon that it's kind of like, it feels like when I was preaching right after Charlottesville, it's like I have no idea how I can make sense of what has happened this week in our world with such carnage and death on a scale that we in the United States have very little conception or understanding of, just based on our privilege and and where we are and how we've benefited from all that we have done, both good and ill.
Yeah.
There are a lot of preachers. This is a lot of preachers listen to this podcast, and this is kind of getting into the homiletical field of what we talk about.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about death this weekend in one way or another. A lot of us are, because we're going to be speaking about what's happened in Gaza and in Israel, and of course the geopolitical stuff is there. And that's again, we don't have the time, unfortunately, to unpack it all. But I wonder what you might be thinking if you were going to step into a pulpit this weekend and say something about the culture of death that we are obsessed with, the violence, the bloodshed, the carnage. How do we turn from that and turn towards God?
Yeah, and I will be preaching this Sunday. I'm an interim in a congregation, actually nearby to where I live. And now I will say we can kind of go any number of directions. I think the liturgy itself has to sort of respect what's happening in this world. In some traditions, that liturgy weekly includes a confession, right? And I think that confessions need to include the sense that how are we also culpable towards the violence that we create, that we see in the other, so how is our language death? What's our vocabulary that is itself violent? That's not to overly pastoral the sheer tragedy of what's happening, but more to your point, what can be said in the sermon itself. And I have to admit, more often than not, I find myself more stating the questions and stating the pain, the brokenness from this, than any sense of, well, here's what I think is we're going to solve it. Because as we alluded earlier, there's so many considerations with it. That's not to intellectualize Gaza, Israel, and for that matter, Middle East politics, but to the point that I remember when the pandemic kind of its descent into all of our lives, and we all had different ways that it descended into our lives. A thought kind of popped in my head about, well, the thing is, I was still interacting on a pastoral way with others. Some people didn't have time to even deal with the pandemic because they were dealing with their own little pandemics. Their lives were already falling apart, or they were in cancer treatment, or, you just fill in the blanks. And so we have to address global concerns. We have to address national concerns. That's our responsibility. But there's also the pastoral concerns that for some, this is also their way of life. Privileged or not, it can also be a way in which to name that which can draw terror or fear or vulnerability. Or let's use the old-fashioned language that's still theologically true, or the sin of humanity. When we other people in our lives and then create these categories of the other must go, in whatever way that looks.
Well, Greg, this is the first time we're talking. I obviously, you're a busy man, so we don't want to take up too much of your time, but I thought I'd give you an opportunity to give us an elevator speech. You are Dean of McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University there in Georgia. I hope you might give us an elevator speech about what you're up to beyond that of talking about death in this really amazing class and making really cool TikToks. What is McAfee up to for the kingdom of God right now?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the elevator speech, and no preacher has an elevator speech, right? They need 20 minutes. But anyway, McAfee, is a delight, as I think many of our partner schools. Duke is a wonderful place as well. What I really love being a part of with McAfee, I usually think it might be, okay, this is a place where we can help train and equip ministers, prepare ministers for the work of the world. I find it's such a great place where everybody's learning. I mean, I learned so much from the students that come here as a cisgender straight white male. I just delight in being with students who are anything but that, and hearing how God is at work in their lives, and how it encourages me to pay better attention to this great movement of God in the lives of others, and to see how ministry is unfolding in specific contexts that I have no experience in. Now, that sounds very self-serving, but where I'm going with that is that we're all doing that. We're all learning from each other, and there's profound things being said, and we have mentors through books and professors and and sojourners who help us have that conversation. I think McAfee with Mercer University is a great place to have those kind of conversations, safe place to have those kind of conversations. And being a part of a university that overall has a value system that allows us that freedom of thought, where religion in general and our faith in particular is welcomed in the classroom. It's not an exceptional voice, but rather a normal voice to be part of that.
Finally, we give everybody on this podcast, we have one question we ask each season, but I'm actually going to change that a little bit this episode, because I normally ask, who are you grateful for and who would you like to give a shout out to, which you're welcome to do. But I think more interestingly for this conversation, especially on Friday the 13th when we're recording this, it will obviously air tomorrow on Saturday, so people will be past their bad luck, hopefully. How do you want to be remembered, Greg DeLoach, when your time comes that you are no longer making TikTok videos or dean of a school, but you are instead going to be with God?
Yep. And that is so good, because in the last 10 years, I've had to pivot, and that's normal. I'm 57. And so you could say in psychoanalysis, that's a pretty normal development to move from your first half of life to your second half of life. And what I've discovered, and still discovering, so I don't want to be arrogant and say I'm there, but all of the stuff that I thought was really important, that is a church I'm serving, or a degree I've earned, or a position I'm holding in a school of theology, that really matters less and less. This is going to sound cheesy, but at its really basic thing, I am at peace at knowing that I want to be remembered by my children and my grandchildren, and if I live long enough, by those greats, and that's going to be fine. That's okay. I was never meant to be remembered much beyond the people whom I know best and love best. I'm a grandfather as of 6 months ago, and from a mortality standpoint,
that's a big deal. That's a big deal.
It's a tremendous deal. It's much better than being a parent, I'm here to tell you. But seriously, the vulnerabilities as a parent are one thing. But when I was holding my grandchild, he was maybe a week old or so. We were there visiting, and we had that moment where we were just looking at each other. And I know developmentally, his eyes were not yet focused as well, but there was this reality that I'm not going to outlive you, statistically speaking. I'm not going to outlive you. And one day I will be such a distant memory, maybe, who knows? I mean, who knows? And that moment is going to be good enough. It really is. It really would be good enough. And so I can die. I hate to sound like Simeon, but behold, my eyes have seen thy salvation. I can feel like I can enter the shalom of God, and it will be okay. Because at the end of the day, Rob, I'm just a picture on a hallway that in church, you're just a few years removed from people not even knowing who you are. In academic institutions, you are only one graduating class removed from people no longer knowing who you are. So anyway, that's a long answer to a really good question. I'm telling you, I want to be remembered by the people I love, and to know that we loved one another, and that's going to be just fine.
I would be remiss to ask, I believe that people can audit this class or
That's
take it
correct.
in such a way that how might they get in touch with you to make that happen?
You know what, if you just contact us at Mercer University School of Theology, we'll set you up. Our website is theology.mercer.edu. If you just contact us, we'll get you lined up. And you're right, they can audit the class. They don't have to enroll as a student. They do have to have an undergraduate degree, but otherwise it's a very inexpensive and accessible way. In fact, one more thing I'd add to an audit, unlike being a student, you don't have to write papers. You're not going to get tested on it. You can attend what you want to attend to or not. You're the auditor, and it's okay. The students, however, have a lot of work.
Well, that's how it goes, isn't it? So, Greg DeLoach, Thank you so much for coming on Beloved Journal.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and I hope to be back again sometime.
Beloved Journal is a podcast on a mission. Check out our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Today's podcast was hosted by the Reverend Rob Lee. Find him on Twitter at RobLee4 or on Instagram at RevRobLee. You can find our social media on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter by searching for Beloved Journal and finding our logo. Beloved Journal's theme music is a cover of the Golden Girls theme song done by MIPSA. Seriously, they're the best band in the world. This podcast was the dream of Stephanie Lee and was produced by Maggie the Golden Doodle and Frank the Poodle. Go show the world that it's worth fighting for. And as always, thanks for listening.